as Nancy said, we are here to tell you a family story today. And, I think there's a couple families, actually, right? River Road is a sibling congregation to the Washington Ethical Society, which I serve. The Washington Ethical Society has been historically a member of the American Ethical Union, but about 10 years ago joined the Unitarian Universalist Association and got a whole bunch of siblings
like
at
us.
that time, like you, exactly. And Nancy and I are, sort of colleague family to each other, right? We actually have children about the same age. And originally, my daughter, who's a year older, used to pass clothing down to her daughter, but then her daughter got taller than my daughter. So for a little while, we got clothing back, actually. So that was convenient, it's just sort of a helpful, minister clothing exchange.
Yeah. We need all the help
could just
we
talk
can
about
get.
that, or we could talk about humanism. And so the family of humanism spans numerous different siblings and cousins kind of swimming in the same sea together. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. What we want to explore today is who is in that family, who is at the picnic table that Nancy described during the Time for All Ages, who has been there historically, who needs a place at that table, and how can we make sure that we're inviting as broadly and as deeply as possible?
And humanism among Unitarian Universalists really rose to be perhaps the prominent ideology in our tradition right around the same time that this congregation was being founded. So in the late 50s and the early 60s, at a time when in this country so many were trying to use religion as a way to beat down progressive social reform, at a time in our country when people were trying to solidify a culture of fear using the tool of religion to keep us in Vietnam, to stir the fires that would burn in the Cold War, the people who gathered to form this congregation said, no, religion is not about fear. Religion is about power and possibility in the connections of human people and what we can do when we join together for higher purpose. And while the humanism at the heart of this congregation is connected to, the metaphysics, who believes in God, who doesn't, in a larger and maybe more important sense, it's about resistance. Humanism at the heart of this place and at the heart of Washington Ethical Society is about resistance to the powers of the world that would steal religion for its own purposes. In this way, at the very heart of humanism is a centering of the human story rather than the divine story. Humanism in these congregations is about the power we have to impact the world. From the very start, it was always so. And rising to lead and to speak in the footprints of those leaders who came before us has never been easy. And so today, both of these congregations stand in turn shakily and boldly on the shoulders of the generations who wrote and talked and worked for bold resistance before us. We gather because of the powerful voices that demonstrated humanism in the 60s and 70s in the streets of our city, and the spirituality of service that was evidenced in the humanism preached right here in the 80s and 90s. And together we are called to ask, what exactly is humanism today? Because our age calls for resistance too, doesn't it? Not just politically, not just in terms of the social justice that we are always doing together, but on the ground of our own spiritual lives. This age calls for resistance to a culture all around us that would tell us we are nothing more than consumers, and that the connections we make to one another are unimportant compared to how much we can contribute to the overall economy that makes us nothing but users. Our humanist heritage tells us that our faith can be a form of resistance when we have faith in each other. And our faith calls us back to connection, to wholeness and love, even for a world as broken as this one.
So I love what Nancy has shared about the resistance to consumerism, because it's such a core part of the beginning of ethical culture, the tradition that Wes has been historically a part of. Back in 1876, when Felix Adler started ethical culture, it was in part because he wanted people to have an alternative both to traditional religion and to the kind of materialism and consumerism that he saw out there. So I want to tell you a little bit about the larger family of humanism, of which both ethical culture and Unitarian Universalism and a whole lot of other things are a part. Somehow Nancy got the inspiring humanist heritage part, and I'm going to talk to you about ducks. Okay.
It's inspiring still, trust me.
The ducks.
Yeah, the ducks.
The ducks are inspiring.
Sell it.
I'm gonna go for it. So humanism is not really a story of, this person taught this person, and they all agreed on a series of thoughts. It's actually a story more of ideas that move around among different people and that they argue over endlessly. I would say so much arguing.
So much.
That's the humanist tradition, right? So we talk sometimes about humanism having started kind of in the late 19th, early 20th century, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of our ancestors. But now humanism is broad enough that it includes not just folks like ethical culture and Unitarian Universalism, kind of traditionally religious humanist bodies or institutions, but also folks who would consider themselves to be secular humanists. This is where the ducks come in. My folks at Wes often ask me about the difference between religious humanism and secular humanism. And I like to say, if you quack like a duck, then you're a religious humanist. That's so beautiful. It was inspiring.
Really?
So I think about religion in kind of sociological terms, right? How does something function? How does it act? And so religious humanists act religiously. They gather together in community. They do it once a week. They might sing together. Am I describing anybody that
You are. Can I just add, if no less than 3 clergy women put on matching outfits and stand in front of you on a Sunday morning, you might be religious humanists.
Right.
Carry on.
That's right. It's really about the matching outfits and the quacking. So secular humanists, on the other hand, might gather together to have a book group or listen to a lecture and talk with each other, right? The core values may be very similar. The how it happens is kind of different. I actually have a colleague, James Croft, an ethical culture leader, who talks about it not as religious humanism, but as congregational humanism. And I think that's helpful for folks. Sometimes, some of my folks are still a little bit itchy about the word religion, just like a small allergy. And so congregational humanism can be a way of thinking, how do we quack? How do we gather together? So Unitarian Universalism and ethical culture have gathered together religiously or congregationally for many, many years in a humanist setting. And we are actually, surprisingly, the old guys around, right? We're the institutional version of congregational humanism, or really of humanism in general. And part of what we want to explore today is to think about whose voices have traditionally been part of that institutional humanism, and how those of us within institutional humanism now, so that's Nancy and it's me and it's all of you as well, how we can open up, make sure that we have at that table, that family table, all the voices that are part of humanism now. Because we are at an unbelievably exciting moment for humanism nationally, I think, in America, where we see different forms of humanism popping up in wildly different ways. They don't all quack, right? Some of them are, ribbiting or something, they're honking maybe. They're exploring humanism differently than they've explored it before.
And I think what's important in that is to acknowledge that humanism will change, our traditions will change. In a very real sense, Amanda and I, we are institutionalists. We were trained to be congregational leaders. We were trained to fundraise for those institutions. We were trained to show up in board meetings. And at some point, I told Amanda Weatherspoon in the last couple of weeks, I am shocked that I have become like the man. Not like the man, but like the man, right? And so we need to be embracing the ways in which humanism is evolving, and the way to do that is to somehow extricate from our hearts the fear that the humanism we knew 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago might be dying are declining, are changing, because when we lift up the ancestors of our humanist tradition, what we praise in them is their boldness, what we praise in them is their innovation, what we do not talk about is them being gripped by fear. And so if we want to create a humanism that we send forward into the next generation, we cannot hold on fearfully to what we have known, but be bold and unafraid to create something new together. That is how we honor our ancestors, and that's what they would have wanted of us.
That's right. That's right. And so we want to tell you some of those ancestor stories, and they are not fearful stories. No. These are folks who, in their time, acted in ways that were full of resistance and rebellion and beauty and courage. So we're going to tell you some of those ancestors, and I think, Nancy, you're going to start us off.
This is the one where I'm worried I'm going to cry. Like, I'm already about to cry.
I'll get tissues ready.
So one of the most prominent voices in American humanism, really in the last 50 years, was my predecessor here as senior minister, Bill Murray. Bill Murray's humanism was an open-hearted humanism that invited us not to just to declare what we don't believe, but to declare what we did believe in, and to uplift the beauty we found in each other, and yes, in our worship life, so that we could build a better world, not out of rejection, but out of love. And Bill, I just told Amanda this story this morning, Bill is not just a part of your family or the family of humanism, he's a part of my family. He was the one who let me into seminary. The story goes like this, that when I was 20, I found myself in his office at Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is where he went when he left this church. He went to Meadville Lombard to encounter, young punks like me. And I found myself in his office, and I was rattling off things like, I just left a convent, and I don't know who I am, and I think I'm supposed to be a preacher. And Bill took this deep breath, and he said, yeah, so you need to come here and arrive next fall and go to seminary. And I said, Bill, don't I need to meet with an admissions committee or something? And he said, no, I'm just going to decide you should be here.
I have posited that Nancy might not even have a Master's of Divinity. No. We don't even know. It was totally backdoor.
I think it was just a handshake deal with our Minister Emeritus, Bill Murray. And when we had that exchange, and when I arrived the next fall, and Bill promptly put me on 3 different committees, neither of us ever guessed that I would wear his shoes, that I would stand behind his pulpit, nor that I would preach his eulogy from our pulpit all those years since. We opened doors for each other. And Bill never asked me to come here and be him. He asked me to come and love you and proclaim a humanism that could grow with all of us as we move forward together.
So sometimes our ancestors are people that we have had the fortune of knowing and loving. And sometimes our ancestors are pictures on the walls that we have heard stories about. And that's the case in ethical culture. The founder I mentioned, Felix Adler, was a guy who's been studying to be a rabbi and decided instead to start a new movement when he was 24. So we're already past our peak. Not only are we the man, but we're past our prime.
So old.
So he started this new movement at 24. And here's the funny thing about Felix Adler. He actually didn't consider himself to be a humanist. Humanism was, alive and well during his lifetime, and he didn't sign the Humanist Manifesto. He didn't take that label on. He actually believed in a kind of divinity within. The Godhead enshrined within me bows to the Godhead enshrined within you is a whole beautiful, deeply sacred thing. And the thing that's fascinating to me about that is that it reminds us that sometimes our ancestors weren't even themselves humanists, right? Here's ethical culture, this tradition that is firmly a part of the humanist family now, founded by a man who didn't claim that title, who thought differently, and yet whose ideas continue to inform who we are today and then inform, therefore, the rest of humanism. So sometimes when we imagine our ancestors, we think of those who spoke about the worth of every person, who spoke about liberation and possibility, who didn't themselves claim the title humanist, but who gave to our movement now the values that we hold dear.
And you know who spoke about liberation and possibility, even when kind of our people didn't want to really hear it.
Yeah.
Jane Addams.
Now, I feel like you got to talk about Jane Addams last time, and I should get to have Jane Addams this time.
Yeah, but here is the thing. Your people were not very good to Jane Addams.
That's so true. It's so
Ours
true.
weren't great, but you know,
yeah.
Jane Addams, you might know her as, of course, sort of the mother of American social work. She founded Whole House in Chicago, which helped hundreds of people, including unwed mothers and young children, make a way when there was no way in like Dickensian poverty in Chicago. When Jane Addams found a home in religion in the Presbyterian Church, of course they wouldn't give her a pulpit to preach from. And so her next stop was at the Chicago Ethical Culture Society. And as she tried to build a relationship with them, of course they said, no, you can't be our clergy person either. She eventually very briefly...
She was a woman, that's why.
Yeah, that's
she
why.
was a woman.
If you didn't catch.
Yeah.
She very briefly held an interim position at the Ethical Culture Society in Chicago, and sometimes she would come hang out with the Universalists in Chicago. But the boldness, the rabble-rousing courage of someone who said our work is right here in this world among one another, it influenced the entire world and all of what humanism would become.
That's right. That's right. So rabble-rousing women, often not featured in our portraits, but a core part of who our movement has been, although their names are not always lifted up in our history books, right? Their portraits aren't on our walls. I heard actually about a rabble-rousing woman recently within the ethical culture movement that I wanted to introduce you to. Her name was Cora Calhoun Horn. And she was part of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. She was an African-American woman who was involved in the Harlem Renaissance, and her sister had some romantic liaison with W.E.B. Du Bois. It was a whole thing. Anyway, she was involved with the Harlem Renaissance, with the Urban League, and the NAACP. And she had a granddaughter who was in her care for some time, whom she took with her to the New York Ethical Society and eventually enrolled in the Brooklyn Ethical Culture School, which was like an actual school, Monday through Friday kind of school. Her granddaughter went there and was raised up in that school. Well, her granddaughter became famous, it turned out, much later as an artist, and she was interviewed at one point. She had faced incredible racial discrimination and systemic racism through her career, and she was asked why she didn't hate white people. And she said, well, it was in part because at the ethical culture school, I learned that there might be a different way of being together. The granddaughter's name was Lena Horne. And the fascinating thing, now I don't want to say Lena Horne was an ethical culturist, she wasn't, and I don't really like giving people the title after, right? Yeah. But the fascinating thing to me, just the same way we have ancestors who weren't humanists, we also have ancestors who were influenced by ethical culture, right? Folks who were influenced by humanism, whose portraits will never end up on our walls, but whose values intermingle as part of our story.
You take, for instance, Lewis Allen McGee. Lewis Allen McGee in the 1940s was one of the very first African Americans ordained in the Unitarian tradition. This was after he had served as a chaplain during the Battle of the Bulge, and literally in those trenches had lost his faith in a supernatural God. And so McGee, with a degree from my alma mater, where Bill went after he was here, Meadville Lombard Theological School, McGee in Chicago founded his boldly humanist and proudly African American congregation that grew to have hundreds of worshipers every single Sunday, and yet to this day in our movement, almost no one knows his name.
Mm-hmm. It's those names, those ancestors that aren't on our history books and whose portraits aren't on our walls that we want to make sure to bring into that family table, And there are ancestors whose names we do know, right? At the Washington Ethical Society, I have my own mentor whom I get to know and love, Ed Erickson, who served there and worked against the Vietnam War and marched at Selma. Don Montagna, my immediate predecessor, who worked on bringing spirituality into ethical culture and ethical societies. In ethical culture, more broadly, John Lovejoy Elliott brought ethical culture into tenement houses in New York City, and Anna Garland Spencer was the first associate woman leader at the New York Society.
There's so many people who are lifted up in those paintings. In American culture, there's the 19th century's so-called great agnostic Robert Ingersoll, who some of you will remember. There's famously the philosopher of humanism, John Dewey, who I am sure has his bust carved in marble someplace. And there are those who are not carved or painted on anything just yet, like Kendall Gibbons, who for 20 years as a senior colleague to Amanda and I, has been preaching this open-hearted, poetic humanism, and I wonder who will pick up the paintbrush to honor her. I don't know if anyone will paint her portrait, but there are so many whose influence is written on every word we say and everything we do here. There's the great A. Philip Randolph, who helped organize the March on Washington with Dr. King and is often not credited for being one of the first boldly humanist African-American leaders in our modern era. There's Ginger Luke, who preached and loved alongside all of you. There's David Eaton at All Souls Church. There are so...
But here's the thing, Nancy, if we just keep listing all the ancestors, we are not going to get through the descendants. I will say that when we did this at West, we've cut it down for you. It was like 45 minutes, so you should be really appreciative right now.
It was hard.
It was so long. It was okay. They're used to me talking a long time. Okay, so, but we do want to talk about some of the descendants, right? If we gather all the ancestors at that family table, all of the people that have helped to create who we are now, we need to make sure that the spaces and the chairs are open for our descendants, for people who are reimagining humanism in a new way. So I want to start by talking about something called Sunday Assembly. I don't know, how many of you have heard of Sunday Assembly?
See,
oh, wow,
I told
really?
you.
Yeah, no, they don't know about it. Okay, so Sunday Assembly was started in London by two British comedians named Sanderson Jones and Pippa Evans. And they wanted to do something like church without the good bits. Was that very excellent accent? Yeah. Did you like that? Yeah. Thanks for laughing. So they wanted to do church without the God bits. And you know, the truth is that those of us in institutional Unitarian Universalism and ethical culture are sort of like, we invented that in 1840. You know why? You know, right? So they think they've come up with this new thing, and they have in some way, right? They jump a lot more.
Yeah,
Sanderson is like 6'5", and he jumps the entirety of the service. Mm-hmm. They use pop music. It's kind of like a church service / karaoke. They have cake every single time. So there's some things that are different.
Oh my God, they're going to leave our congregations to go there.
It's in London. It's too far. You can't get there.
Yeah.
So, but the interesting thing for us in institutional humanism is we either can be annoyed that they're pretending that they came up with something that we invented like 150 years ago and are taking our market share, or we can be excited that people are coming to humanist values and to the humanist family in new ways, folks that wouldn't have found their way to us, that they're being attracted by the jumping or the karaoke or probably mostly the cake and finding a way to be together in a new place.
There's so many people pushing the edges to build new humanist communities and new ideas about what humanism can be. There's somebody like Diana Burkholder. You got Mandisa Thomas. I got Diane Burkholder, who in Kansas City is building a collective of non-believers of color that preaches that everything we do has to be at the intersection of all our identities. And I'm super jealous because you're actually working with her to build the Humanist Collaboratory. Like, you got a conference call with her coolness tomorrow. You're that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I do. No, she's pretty great. Actually, it's just that I get to talk to her that makes me great. She's awesome. So the other person that I wanted to lift up was the name of Mandisa Thomas. I got to meet Mandisa in June when she received the Person of the Year Award from the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association. Mandisa is the founder of Black Nonbelievers, and she is creating networks, particularly out of her own story as a Black woman, feeling as though coming out as an agnostic and then atheist within her community was a particular kind of challenge in a community that has long been connected with historical and traditional church experiences. And so she's creating these little groups all around the country, providing support and care and community, and then going further, right? Creating the kind of community that we have here. It doesn't quite quite like a duck, but it quacks similarly, you know? And it offers us an opportunity to think about that. So much of the exciting humanist innovation that's happening right now is actually happening in these pockets created and led by people of color around the country. Hispanic free thinkers, African Americans for humanists, for humanism, Mandisist, Black non-believers group. And I think there's an opportunity there both for us in predominantly and historically white institutions to consider how our welcome has not been broad enough for folks, humanists of color, to find their home here in large numbers, right? And also just to be excited, just to be celebrating this humanism that is happening in different ways all over the country.
And there is another key demographic of up-and-coming, rising, bold humanists that we need to lift up, which is, of course, young, white, hipster guys with cool haircuts.
Oh, young, white, hipster guys
There's
with cool
those
haircuts.
guys.
That's
a big
whole
subsection, like Chris Stedman, who wrote a book called Faithiest, who does all this interesting work about the intersection of atheists and traditional believers working together for social justice. There's Casper ter Kuile, who works with On Being, Krista Tippett's show. He calls himself a non-believing Unitarian Universalist, and also he goes around in every single platform he can find declaring that CrossFit gyms are basically just like church, which in my experience is not entirely untrue.
That's right. Nancy is, as you probably know, kind of an evangelist for CrossFit, but I am resisting. I am holding strong.
It's not working.
And I'm not going to show up there.
No.
So in addition to these folks that are exploring humanism outside of our institutions in new ways, making it up, right, as they go along, adding to our tradition, there are also folks within our institutional settings that are exploring new kinds of humanism. In ethical culture, we have a number of folks who are studying to become ethical culture leaders. That's the title for clergy there, right? And two of them, Jay Hooper and Christian Hayden, when they are certified as leaders, will become the only people of color leading in ethical culture, the only people of color who are clergy within the ethical culture tradition. I am so excited about the way that they are changing how we do ethical culture with each other. Jay Hooper, who is an artist and comes out of the Pentecostal tradition, talks about himself as a Pentecostal ethical culturist. He invites people into seeing ethical culture in a radically new way. Christian Hayden does the same thing as he explores a Pan-African ethical culture. So they're inviting us outside of our institutions from within, right from within the institutions. Now, I will say that those of us in ethical culture are pretty jealous of those of us in Unitarian Universalism. Since I'm in both, I guess I'm jealous of myself.
Indeed.
I'm so jealous. Oh no, I know, it's okay, you'll get there. Because Unitarian Universalism already has so many amazing people of color who are clergy, and particularly within the humanist tradition of Unitarian Universalism. Like, for instance, the amazing Amanda Weatherspoon, who I got to meet for the first time a couple weeks ago. We were at a rally together, and I think I was supposed to keep her from getting arrested.
Didn't work.
I failed. I am very sorry. I'm not that sorry, though, actually, because it was great that she got arrested. It was amazing. And now I've heard her do meditation and prayer. So good job snatching her up, guys. That was really well done. So we have within our own institutions folks that are inviting us into new understandings of what humanism looks like, right?
And I came behind the pulpit to brag on you because there is my friend Amanda Poppei leading right here, calling together the Humanist Collaboratory for the second year and bringing bold new ways to humanism, to ethical culture, to Unitarian Universalism. And there are all of you, who are, after all, both descendants and ancestors. You will rise up to create something new for the generations to come. For we are gathered in a time when who we mean when we say we is an ever-expanding concept. And humanism is reaching far beyond the doors of the institutions that clergy leaders like Amanda and I have been trained to serve. The table of the humanist tradition is set, but not just in sunny rooms like this one, not just around the table at board meetings, not just in the regular gatherings of reasonably traditional, usually middle class, often predominantly white people. The table is set but it invites us to gather in places and in spaces we've only just begun to imagine.
Part of what our task is, those of us within the institutions that have held congregational humanism for so long, our task is to make sure that we have as many seats open at this table. And in fact, to remember that the table's not even our table. It's our table, right? That bigger we. And I think it's important to know that we get to stay at the table, right? No one is suggesting that those of us in institutional humanism have to leave so that the table can change over completely. No, it's about making sure that we're all here, all of our ancestors, all of our descendants, that we're attuned to and aware of the difference between form, right, what we think humanism has traditionally looked like, which can change as new descendants join us, and core values, right? The inherent worth of every person, the idea that we are radically connected to each other as part of the human family, that stays the same even when we quack or ribbit or jump up and down like Sanderson. That's really who we are and what connects us as a human family. That table set before us has all our ancestors, all our descendants, and room for more whose names we do not yet know. And it is an honor to be part of that family together.